Iran has strongly condemned the U.S., quote, deceitful and opportunistic support for recent protest rallies in some Iranian cities. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman stressed U.S. administration has proven to be the leader of ill-wishers against the Iranian nation. Badr Qasemi noted that Iranian people very well remember Washington's big vindictiveness and hostility toward them. The remarks were in response to U.S. reaction to protests. Washington said, quote, the world is watching Iran. It also called on the Iranian government to respect people's rights, including their right to expression. And joining us out of Bristol for more on the stories, Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Hello, Tony. Hope you're doing well. Your thoughts, please, Tony.
Well, we've heard today Washington saying that the Iranian government must respect rights of freedom of expression. Well, that's true. But that would be nice if Washington and London would do the same. For example, with the violent breakup of the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy London protests, evictions of the people who were trying to protest against the excesses of Wall Street in London. You know, do you remember the 1%? Also, Trump has said the world is watching. Well, I can tell Donald Trump the world is watching what the United States are up to, but in the South China Sea, in places like Syria, and also in South America, in Central America. The world is watching what the United States is doing as well with its covert power. Just because it's not on CNN doesn't mean to say the world isn't watching. The Iranian government has a right, though, to be nervous about these protests, and it's a sign of a mature democracy that protests are happening, and that where they're peaceful, the police are controlling them, but where they're violent, the police are moving in. That is a sign of a normal democracy. But the Iranian government actually seems to be listening. They're saying, well, we are going to do something about these austerity measures. The trouble is, in the West, we see protest after protest. 2 million people on the streets of London protesting against the Iraq war achieved absolutely nothing. The Iraq war went ahead anyway. The same with the student fees protests. Tens of thousands of students protesting those, nothing changed. And the same with the austerity protests. In fact, the Theresa May's government has increased those. So it's a dangerous part of the world to have protests, because the trouble is, as we've seen in Syria, foreign powers will come along potentially and actually help, aid financially, and even arm your demonstrators. So it's, I think, a sign of maturity that this has been able to happen.
And if the world, let's just say, if Washington's watching Iran, I mean, has Washington failed to watch protests in Saudi Arabia, in the eastern province, where Shias are trying to get equal rights in the country, totally marginalized, and how they're dealt with, by Riyadh, or in Bahrain, how Shias are dealt with there by the regime?
Well, Bahrain is, for us in Britain, is a better example, really, because Bahrain has got a long connection with Britain. Britain has just built its own new naval base in Bahrain, and there is no support from Britain or the United States for the protests going on in those countries. I just think we've got to see this in context of an attempt to get a war started with Iran. I mean, we've seen in that part of the world a lot of attempts at regime change, and this is what they do. They will encourage protests on the streets, and then what they will do is potentially arm demonstrators. This has happened in Libya. This has happened after Colonel Gaddafi was killed. All the mercenaries were shipped over into Syria to start violent protests. And they haven't actually explained on the television in the West or on the radio whether the protests have been violent. All they've shown is the police violence against the protesters. So we know that this sort of thing goes on. We also know that there is the context of many attempts to destabilize. I mean, look, people don't remember that after the 1979 revolution in Iran, there was a massive bomb which was inspired by the West, almost certainly the United States, that killed 73 of the top politicians and judges, and then the president himself, the second president of Iran, was blown up by a terrorist attack. Most of analysts say was sponsored by the West. So there has been a constant attempt to destabilize ever since the revolution of 1979. So I think it's very brave, actually, of the Iranian government to allow these protests to happen. But let's remember also, much bigger were the pro-government protests, and you would never get any kind of pro-government protest, very unlikely at all in Britain. Not even 10 people coming out on the streets to support Theresa May, because there is no popular support for the government. It's just simply, I mean, they managed to get in elections because they're effectively bribing the super rich, and also, or they're bribing many of the wealthy people with tax cuts and that sort of thing. But there is no popular support, really, I don't think, in Britain for the Conservatives anymore. And so you wouldn't see any kind of pro-government protest in Britain. And yet we've seen tens of thousands of people out on the streets of Iran supporting their government. And we've seen very little commentary about that here on the British TV.
We got to go, Tony. I want to thank you for joining us out of Bristol, Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Thanks, bud.